Thank you very much, and hello from Cardiff in Wales. So, bore da. I always like to start a presentation with some Cymraeg, some Welsh, because I speak Welsh, and it is the best language. But I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm Matthew Batten, and thank you for the great introduction. This is based on my research that I think I've dedicated far too much time over the last few years into digital culture and religious authority. I work within a church context and within a church institutional context, and religious culture within a digital culture is something that I'm really fascinated by, because I don't think it's something that we can ignore, and I don't think it's something that church authorities always get right. And so I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of my research today. Okay, so as I said, this is based on my research that I've just completed and got a master's in digital theology. And what I was looking at was religious culture and religious authority. So how religious authority shifts because of social media and digital culture. And I've been using the case study of the Makin review, which I'll go into a little bit more detail, because I don't like to assume everybody knows the ins and outs of the Church of England and what's going on. But it's a case study that we'll go through that will give you an overview and an example of how religious authority plays out in a digital culture. We can also look a little bit about old power versus new power, which is a model that was created by Hyman and Timms, who are business consultants, but I think gives a really good overview of the power dynamic that happens between traditional religious structures and new emerging cultures that we see within social media and digital culture and digital platforms. And then I'm going to be looking at the emergence of religious digital activists online, the people who are challenging religious authority because of their knowledge of social media and digital culture as well. And then we're just going to sort of like think a little bit about what happens next. What is the implications of this in what we do? Okay, we're going to start with defining what I mean by authority. So, I'm going to start by defining what I mean by traditional religious authority. Now, traditional religious authority, or authority in general, is the moral, legal right or ability to control or influence thought and opinion and behavior. It's often very role-based, so linked to office. It can be very institutional, so based on ecclesiastical roles and traditional legal structures of an organization. And it's often very relational as well, so it's very trust-based. And you can see this kind of traditional authority being played out in very traditional hierarchical organizations like the Church of England. Because if you think about authority that exists within these structures, it is role based. So it is based on your role within that structure. So if you are the bishop, you are essentially the head of an organization, or the archbishop. Your authority comes because of that role. You are, because of a legal structure, its institution very ecclesiastical, so your authority comes with your stature, with your role within the organization. And it's also very relational as well. We tend to trust our bishops, we tend to trust those people who are in charge, the ones who have ascended to the top of an organization chart, through experience, through knowledge, guiding us. And we kind of tend to traditionally look up to people like that who are guiding us. But those authority structures, those traditional authority structures, are shifting, they're changing because of digital culture. And shifting authority is a term that Heidi Campbell, who's a digital theologian, a theologian who focuses on digital religion, has come up with. And she talks a lot about shifting theology. as a process within digital culture where legitimacy and influence and authority is renegotiated through offline leaders and new online actors. So offline leaders like the traditional role-based authority that I was just talking about, and new online actors, these new people who are emerging online, these religious digital creatives, she calls them, that emerge online, who know how to use SEO, search engine optimization, who know how to use great social media tactics to get their voice heard, to get their opinions amplified. And that's what shifting authority is for Heidi Campbell. And this is what I was focusing on. And you see these new religious digital creatives using blogs, using social media and other digital platforms, maybe Substack or Medium, which are proving very, very popular, where these new religious voices are challenging institutions and challenging them in the way that is very different to how things used to be. So people are using blogs and knowing how to write and knowing how to use social media to challenge what we used to just accept. What we used to accept was traditional authority. And these bloggers are people like Andrew Greystone, or Ian Paul, or even bishops like the Bishop of Newcastle using X to call out and challenge some of the decisions that were being made within the Church of England. These are people who are using their voices online to challenge traditional authority. And this is what we call shifting authority in digital culture. So, oops. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Makin review. Now, I did a similar presentation in Estonia for a theology conference that I was at, and I asked people in the room how many people knew what the Makin review is, and not many people put their hand up. I think, being aware that I live in the UK, I think I've lived and breathed this research. So I don't want to assume that everybody knows what this is. So the Makin review was essentially an investigation that was carried out, that investigated the abuse carried out by John Smith. It was a massive, massive case in the UK, and it contributed to the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the fallout that we're still experiencing there. The investigation, this abuse by John Smith went on for years and years. It began in the 70s, continued into the 80s, and continued right the way through his life, and had a detrimental and very serious impact on the people that he abused. Now, the investigation into this happened over a long period of time. It was very, very detailed, and you can read the report online. But it came to the conclusion that senior clergy within the Church of England were aware of the allegations as early as the 80s. Senior clergy were aware of what was going on, but failed to do anything about it. Essentially, it was back in the day where you protect the institution rather than being on the side of those who have been abused and been on the side of survivors. Very old school way of controlling a narrative and controlling a story and protecting an institution. What this meant was Smith was allowed to continue his abuse when he moved from England to South Africa, because there was no follow-up, and it was almost an example of shifting the problem somewhere else. It's not happening to us. We just keep it quiet. What the Makin review concluded was, and it was a very damning conclusion, a very shocking conclusion, that is likely that senior clerics throughout all of this knew of the abuse that was happening. And it even quoted in the report saying that it is likely that the Archbishop of Canterbury knew about what was happening and knew about this abuse. So that was quite a bit of a bombshell report that came out, and it got reported all over the UK press. I think it got reported, across the world as well, and it led to the downfall of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Channel 4 News in the UK was probably one of the strongest journalist outlets that followed this story and reported on it continually. And the report, when it finally came out after years and months of delays, etc., was actually quite a profound moment, I think, in the Anglican Communion, with its admission that senior people did know what was going on in what was one of the worst abuse cases that they've investigated. So this all happened. This all happened very publicly. But what was happening, and I want to explain what happened next and what happened that led up to the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, was essentially what you had was, back in the 80s and 90s, an institution that was protecting itself, protecting its clergy, protecting its reputation. Now, the shift in authority happens around the 80s, 90s then, when digital culture becomes more prolific. We all then have access to things like news blogs. We start having access to message boards, which is where some of Christians, when they were first emerging online, were sharing information, and blogs became something that everyone jumped onto. But what was happening was some of the survivors and the ones who are advocating on behalf of the survivors and their voices were using their blogs to call out and call for change and telling the story of survivors. And they were relentless. They were, absolutely stalwarts in making sure that the survivor voices were heard. And they were documenting pretty much everything that was happening from the point of view of the survivors, calling out misinformation, calling out disinformation as it was emerging, and really holding power to account. And it was these religious bloggers who caught the attention of journalists who could then go on these blogs and find alternative information to what was being put out by religious authorities like the Church of England. So they were finding an alternative source of authority, an alternative source of information and truth. Now, what happens in this situation is, traditionally, leaders withhold or omit information and deny knowledge of this abuse, so that in a way they're controlling the story. It's usually, over the past few years, has always been the voice of those in charge that get heard, but religious culture, thank goodness, has changed that. Because then we have these people who are advocating on behalf of survivors, you have a breakdown then in trust in our authority figures, because alternative truths emerge. And when I say alternative truths, I don't mean that in a fake news kind of way. I mean that in actually the voices of the survivors were finally being heard. And so you have a group of survivors who are doggedly challenging this narrative that we didn't know about it and this hasn't happened, and they are speaking out. And so we have a breakdown in trust as new truths, new information emerges. Now, couple that with digital activism. These new voices who emerge online, as I say, they started on message boards, continued then blogging regularly about this, about what was happening and challenging some of this information. But then you have something like social media that comes along, which then amplifies their message even further, because Twitter takes off in a way that becomes its own source of authority for journalism and people's opinions and voices. And so digital activism emerges that amplifies these new voices and amplifies this challenging message to authority. And so what happens is credibility is redistributed, and that's what we call shift in authority. So credibility is redistributed because it's the people who know how to use digital platforms, SEO, social media, who are gaining traction and challenging the established religious tradition of authority that we've gone to just accept for years. So that's what has happened in this case, and that is what led me to researching a lot more in detail, shift in authority. Now, I want to put this into the context of what Timms and Hyman called old power versus new power, because I think this is something that can help us understand how to appreciate and how to use digital culture and digital platforms differently when communicating in a different way to an age group, to a generation who have lived with new power culture, not old power culture. Okay, so old power culture for me is very much Church of England, for example. It's any institution that has existed for years and years and years and centuries, and is very traditional in its structure. So tends to be very hierarchical. The people at the top are the ones that hold all the power. Tim and Hyman's call this kind of example of old power, where it acts like currency, acts like money, that if you have money, you tend to hoard it. So if you have money that acts like power, you hoard it and you control it and you don't share it. So that's what they describe old power as currency. It's hierarchical. It's closely guarded by the few people who hold power, usually at the top. Very, very little transparency. It's closely guarded and very secretive within the ones who need to know. And then power then is pushed down to the ones who hold less power. It's a form of control. And it's also very role office based. So it tends to be the archbishop, the bishop, then you've got the clerics, everyone else then filters down this power structure. And that's what old power is. Now, new power is very, very different, because new power is essentially what we're seeing in digital culture right now. It's a complete new power that operates in openness and transparency. If you think about platforms like Airbnb, for example, now, whatever you think about Airbnb and the challenges that we have with tourism and Airbnb at the moment, they completely transform travel accommodation, because now people didn't have to stay in hotels. They didn't have to stay where a hotel decides this is where the hotel resort is going to be, and it's going to be in this area, and this is going to be the most popular area for people to stay. Now you have the option as choosing the holiday destination. We have the option to go where we want, because people are putting up their flats, their homes, their apartments for rental. So it's a lot more open, and it's challenging these old power structures of the hotel industry. The power is in our hands as holiday makers to decide where we want to go on holiday and how we want to go on holiday. So there's an openness, a participatory model emerges from all of this as well. What I mean by that is through blogs, the comment section on blogs, reviews on things like Amazon, Airbnb, we can participate in this new power structure. We have a voice. We have what we call co-creation, the option to co-create with people. Blogs that we can write, text messages, social media profiles that we can create. We all have the power to communicate outside of traditional structures, and we can operate in this new power structure in a much more transparent model. And just quoting Heidi Campbell here on my dissertation, the more we engage with new power models, the more these norms are shifting. And what is emerging is a new expectation, an inalienable right to participate. We do not want to be controlled by old power anymore. We have a voice, we have a say, we're used to this in this new digital culture. And what we're seeing in this shift in authority is people emerging, clerics emerging, survivors of abuse emerging, who are operating in a new power environment that is at odds with a very old power structure. And places like any institution that has existed for years, any institution that is hierarchical based, is really slow to change, really slow to accept this new power dynamic that is emerging. Often you'll hear people in authority moaning about social media, moaning about the negative comments. But actually, yes, some of those comments are very nasty and very unpleasant. I'm not saying that. But within all of that is people who are challenging a view that has gone unchallenged for years, for decades. That's what's happening in digital culture as new power emerges. So what happens in this new power culture, in digital culture? Well, it challenges institutional control over the narrative. We now participate. We have the tools, we have the platforms to be able to share information that possibly has not been able to be heard before. So the voices of survivors, for example. New power and digital culture then empowers religious authority under certain conditions. Okay, so I'm not saying that new power shuts down old power, because that is not what happens. So I mentioned very briefly the Bishop of Newcastle in the Church of England. She was someone who was very, very critical when the Makin review came out, and critical of those who knew about the abuse. And she was one of the people that was calling for the resignation of the Archbishop as well. So in some certain circumstances, under certain conditions, it can empower religious authority. She was one of those voices that used her Twitter feed, for example, to add her voice to this. So while she's a bishop and an example of, I would say, traditional religious authority in a hierarchical structure, she actually used social media in a way that went against old power structures and used new power to call for change within the Church of England. We shift from being consumers to being creators. So we are no longer happy just to consume information. We want to contribute to it. We want to create information. We're used to this now. We will challenge authority online. If a bishop, an archbishop, an institution posts something on social media wants us to comment, because the more we comment, the more the algorithms kick in and more people will see our information. And we, as new power consumers and new power creators, know how to use this to get our voices heard. These digital platforms allow us to have a conversation directly with institutions. It allows us to be part of a conversation we were alienated from for many, many years. But new power and digital culture means that we live in a very hyper-connected world that has no geographical boundaries. So, it's not just a small group of people within the Church of England challenging this culture. People from across the world are involving themselves in the conversation, and it creates a movement then online, as we saw with people who, when the Makin review came out, and people who were calling for finally publish this Makin review. This was not just a small subset of people within the Church of England. It was a much more global thing than that. People who were calling for transparency, because that's what we're used to now. Within this new power and within this dynamic that we see within digital culture is a shift in authority that is led by algorithms, so what we call algorithmic authority. And it's really important that we understand this, because new power and old power talk very much about role-based relationships and behaviors that we'd like to see in the way that we operate control and power and authority. But algorithmic authority is really different, because algorithms have the power to influence what people access online. Sorry, my light is going here. And this is a shift in authority, away from authority enacted by humans. Like I was talking about bishops and archbishops having the control going down the hierarchy. Those at the top have the most power. But we shift away from that with algorithmic authority, because it's not necessarily enacted by humans necessarily. It's computer systems and individuals can assert influence and create power structures. So as Heidi Campbell talks about this in her Religious Digital Creatives work, we put our trust in technology and corporate culture to tell us what voices to listen to. Now, what I mean by that is algorithms are what are part of our everyday life and basically dictate what we see online, and it's based on our interests. So you hear a lot about this phrase about living in an echo chamber, but also algorithms really like participation. So the more people participate in, say, a Facebook post, the more people will see it. Because you're commenting, and it says to the algorithms, lots of people are really interested in this, so let's put it up on people's feeds more and more and more, so they see it. Same with things like X and Twitter, TikTok, for example. What we also need to be aware of is algorithms feed off anger as well. I think we need to be alert to that. Is that if you're posting something on Facebook that is going to generate a lot of anger, more people tend to respond to it, and more people get heightened. Everyone has an opinion on it. And when it comes to anything church-based, when it comes to authority and abuse, lots of people get involved in that conversation. So it's very difficult to keep things like this out of the news and out of the limelight like we used to be able to, and we just had broadcast news or newspapers. Now algorithms are showing content to more and more people, particularly if it's getting them commenting and outraged in some way. What we then also have amongst this are new religious actors who emerge, who are skilled in SEO, search engine optimization, and are skilled in digital culture tactics and social media tactics. You only have to look at TikTok and this boom on TikTok priests, this boom with TikTok nuns, who are using what the kind of TikTok is there for as an entertainment channel, and are using it then in a way that gets people who are not particularly religious involved in the entertainment and the enjoyment of what they're putting out. But the same is happening on things like Facebook and TikTok during the whole Makin review period. People were really aware how they can get their voices heard through digital culture and social media platforms. We can use memes, we can use graphics, go on free things like Canva, a free design tool for people, and can use those sort of things to make our message much more visible, much more appealing to far more and more people. And so these new religious actors emerges who are skilled in the area and skilled in using social media in a way that I don't think institutions have always been particularly good at. I think institutions are being good at doing evangelism online, but not so much being involved in conversations and in an open and transparent way. And this is what the shift in authority is happening here. People are challenging religious organizations now. Now, these religious digital activists, this is what I've called this group of people, okay? Religious digital activists, because they are activists in a religious, part of their religious identity operating online. So I've called them religious digital activists. And these new religious digital activists become credible in how they use algorithms, how they use social media to challenge a narrative. So these credible voices begin to emerge, as I said, people who know how to use digital platforms. Often their content, particularly around the Makin review case study that I've been researching, it's very emotional driven content. And as I said earlier, emotional driven content is what algorithms like. So often these religious digital activists, as again within this case study, come from a survivor perspective, voices that have traditionally been ignored or silenced by traditional religious authority structures. So more and more people get involved because they know how to use it, because of the emotion, and everyone has an opinion of it. Now, I've put a bit of a question here. Are they prophets or are they provocateurs? Because it really depends on your opinion on this. Are they prophets where they are the ones who are a source of truth, where they are speaking truth to authority, challenging authority, challenging abuse in religious organizations in a way that is exactly what needs to happen? Or are they provocateurs? We've seen, the downfall of the Archbishop of Canterbury, a church in turmoil. I, you know, I'm alive to the question of, does this play into secularism? Because actually, are we turning in on ourselves and criticizing Christian culture and Christian authority in a way that plays into secularism? Well, you see online people saying, well, it's the church, they can't be trusted, all these kind of things. It's a balance, I think, between prophets and provocateur. I think, in this aspect, had these religious digital activists not used their voices, not used digital platforms, and didn't advocate on behalf of the survivor, people would have got away with it and survivor voices would not have heard. I think in this case, they did the right thing and they were prophets in calling power to account. But it's something to bear in mind, because digital culture and new power isn't a new thing or new power isn't a new thing, and challenging religious authority isn't a new thing. This has gone on from, back to the 60s, if not before, where, the counterculture movement was happening. What we're seeing is a counterculture movement in a way that is now just emerging online digital culture, and we all now have a voice to play in that. So I want to leave time for questions, because I think we're all in our jobs or in our roles where a lot of this touches upon. So I just want to end with a couple of thoughts around this. Social platforms and digital media create spaces outside of institutional control, and that's the big shift. The control for narrative is the shift in authority. It's not the people who hold the power that are controlling information anymore. We operate in new power structures, and we have a voice, and we are able to operate outside of institutional control. The religious digital activists, the bloggers, the people who hold power to account through use of social media and SEO, for example, can create a change within their religious community. Now, we've seen this, as I was saying, with Bishop of Newcastle using her voice and her position within a hierarchical structure to create change. And then other priests backed her. So again, priests who are within that hierarchical structure were speaking out as well. Whereas before, I would say a couple of years ago, it would have been unheard of for a priest to challenge hierarchy, but now they've got their voices to be able to do that, and they've got the platforms to do it, and they are able to then create change within that religious community. And what we have then are a group of religious digital activists who emerge as a credible source of religious authority. So we no longer have to rely on quotes from priests, archbishops, bishops, in newspapers or news reports. We can now find alternative sources of information online. And some of the bloggers, like Andrew Greystone, for example, has created, almost an archive of information of survivors of abuse, and he uses that then to document, almost counter to what the official voices were saying back in the day. And finally, just something to leave us thinking about, as we are Christian communicators as well, and Christ said, "We are the light. I am the light, the way, and the light, the source, the truth." I've got that quote wrong, but new power values trust. New power values transparency and openness. And for me, those are theological imperatives. I think we need to be operating in more of a new power model, in a new power mode, because Christ calls us to be the light. Christ calls us to be the truth. And I think those new power values of trust, transparency, and openness are theological imperatives that we need to pay a lot more attention to. And on that note, I shall stop sharing my screen and invite you to comment or ask any questions. I'd be very happy to hear from you.